Javier, how are you, sir? I enjoyed your piece. Thank you for writing that. That was delightful. Thank you for writing that piece.
Oh yeah, no problem. I totally, the conversation that we had last night was really fruitful for thinking through. It all connects. Your ideas all connect. Right? Non-rational, the encounter, the surprise, beauty. Um, though I when I was writing it, I was like, how does he explain irrational again? Or was I on the money with that? Um, how are you describing irrational when you approach it?
No, I think that's a tremendous question. No, I had a wonderful time speaking last night. So thank you. It was a lot of fun. I don't know where the hours went by, and the great
Mhm.
Thomas Winn. So it is good to see you. So for me, irrational would be just say, for example, jumping off a cliff or something. Something just kind of
Mhm.
crazy and stupid, right? The
Mhm.
issue is because we're not saying rational is bad, non-rational is good. The issue is that rationality very often eclipses non-rationality because it works. It's more natural, it's more quantifiable, it's more ready at hand, to use that kind of language. And, I was having that talk with Theory Underground on the difference between conversation and communication. It's kind of similar. It's not that communication is always bad, it's that it works and it has a tendency to replace conversation. Precisely because it is more linear in its purpose, it's more direct, you can see what it's getting at. Like if I'm trying to communicate to you how to make the car work or what my day is, that's more at hand than, say, a conversation where we don't know what we're going to talk about, where we're going to end up, and we're circling something, right?
Mhm.
So what ends up happening is naturally communication replaces conversation, as quantification replaces qualification, as rationality replaces non-rationality. And then once it makes that replacement, it presents an opposite that seems to be it presents an opposite that seems to cover the rest of the possible choices you can make, but really it's nothing more than the, say, lack of rationality, for example, right? Whereas non-rationality is not really a lack of rationality, it is that of which makes rationality possible. You have to start with a non-rational. Just like, Mr. Jockin was saying in Aristotle, the first principle has to be demonstrated. So what ends up happening is rationality races in. It tends to train us to think exclusively in its terms. And then the opposite is, and then the only other category you seem to need is irrational, and you're covered. Now you understand the entire world, right? It seems to blanket everything in those categories. But that presentation of two options is actually concealing the third of
Mhm.
non-rationality that you require. But since it's concealing it, you may go through life never realizing it's there. That's why it's so dangerous. And Mr. Parsons, good to see you. And the other side of this is once we take sociology seriously, if there is a movement toward the quantifiable, the rational, the planned, et cetera, so forth, at the expense of the others, those also get all of that kind of thinking tends to be stitched into and integrated into the very structure of society itself. So then you get trained according to that infrastructure. You absorb that zeitgeist, and it's not even necessarily taught to you directly. It's just how everything goes. It's just what one thinks, what one does. And that further conceals the role of non rationality. And once that occurs, Mr. Wynn, good to see you, sir. Then, if all you have are the categories of rational and irrational, when it comes to like the example you made of poetry, well, you can only think of it as either rational or irrational. And you don't even
Mhm.
realize there's a third way to understand it. And so that possibility conceals itself because of your habituation, but because of the categories that are presented, et cetera, so forth, right? And also, I guess another characteristic of irrationality, I'll give it back to you, is that irrationality clear in a way can you choose the irrational? Like this is it's almost a kind of false choice too, right? Like you
Right.
couldn't
Mhm.
choose the irrational because like if you did then it would be rational to choose just to make a point that you could or something, right? Like this is the other
Mhm.
thing. There's something false about the irrational as an option. It is tends to simply be a way we quantify the behavior of other people. This is the real problem with irrationality as a category at the exclusion of non-rational. I'm never irrational. I might be wrong, But I have good reason for why I'm wrong, but that doesn't make me
Mhm.
irrational. I just made a mistake, right? Irrationality is a term that we tend to use to describe other people from our point of view or relative to our assessment of what they should have done, right? And certainly there can be irrationality in that, well, if you believe that the car was going to go down $10,000 next week, why did you buy it this week, right? There's a certain irrationality that can be an appeal to a person's beliefs where you didn't follow through if you actually believe that, or yourself. You can say, I was really irrational. I knew I could get this house for cheaper. I'm just making an example. I knew I could buy it for cheaper in 2 weeks, but I got nervous and went on and did it, right? So there are sometimes when people use the word irrational, it speaks to some sort of deficit, the emotions got to you, you got anxious. And I think the term in that sense can be valid. But the problem is, actually, I would argue, because we've been, in my opinion, searching for the term non-rational, we've used the word irrational to do too much, like to describe as absurdism or abstract art or different forms of, thinking, like a Samuel Beckett play or something like that, right? And
Mhm.
we actually have not had this category of activity of which makes it possible to engage in rationality. So I'll give it to you, Javier, and then Mr. Winn. Javier, any thoughts or anything about clarifying
Yeah,
questions?
yeah, no, yeah, no, this is great because like even if you begin from Heidegger's being in time, which I think is such a good like accurate depiction of just like well, rationality kind of carries like both rationality and irrationality kind of carry little weight because Heidegger's argument is, well, we're already practical. Like we're already practical in our being. And then we get to this theoretical point of view, right? It's practical, then theoretical, right? It's when something breaks away from the practical that we start theorizing. So there's a sense in which practical, I mean, rationality is just another word for saying what's practical, right? Like it's what's irrational is impractical, right? It's not really um, accurate to do this because of the way the world seems to work, which is a kind of practical assessment. So then it gets kind of weird that we have a philosophy like pragmatism come out because then it's like, oh well, that's kind of weird. Um, but yeah, it's and then like I gave the example with the poetry thing, which is like, well, what good reasons do we have to write a novel, to make poetry, to do anything when really the most practical, efficient use of your time would be just to just say it. Why beat around the bush with all these descriptions about what the experience is? Why don't you just say you had a bad time, right? Like it's like, well, that is the practical thing to do. I could just say I had a bad time, but that doesn't why is there something missing in that, which is very interesting? Why is there something where instead of explaining, I'm describing, and in my describing, something occurs. It's as if description is a way to break you out of the practicality that you're already inherent in and kind of get you in this moment of, huh, I never thought about that for some reason. I never even imagined that kind of experience being possible. And that's kind of what poetry does. It just kind of brings you into these glimpses of experiences that you never thought possible, um, without trying to suck the meaning dry out of it. Um, so yeah, I mean, it's very fascinating that irrationality is often quite basically synonymous with impracticality and then economics, and it's just all everything is tied to the economic situation. And I think you're right on that. I mean, I think even when we talk about rationality and what's irrational seems deeply tied to the economic situation. A lot of our conversation is kind of tied around, well, that's kind of irrational, right? Like even the emotional side, saying it's irrational, is a way to say, well, that's not the efficient use of our economic conversation, right? We can economize our conversation in communication versus conversation, because having a conversation leads to go to nowhere. So even then, we sort of economize our speaking to make it clear and cut, which is again very interesting. But yeah, that's it.
I think the idea that rational just becomes a simile for practical is extremely important, because like that's where when someone like the neo-pragmatist it kind of come along and it's like, well, all that's left is pragmatism to kind of recover it in a Richard Rorty or stuff like that. Well, the issue is then you're actually saying that what's left is the basis by which we define our thinking. Like we have to rethink the basis, and maybe our categories are too limited, right? Because what we define as rational is what's practical. But of course, the problem, like another way to look at irrational is it's just a straw man that rationality sets up to knock down and verify itself, right? It's not an actual alternative, which then, of course, means rationality is always one way. It's always on a single path. So you better hope that path is a good one. But if it's a Kafka hallway leading to a techno chulu, as Mikey Downs is saying with Nick Land, or it's leading to a certain loss of the human being, you're in major trouble. And you see, if you only have the category of irrational as the alternative of the rational, well, then there is no alternative. That's the problem. There's a way in which irrational is a false choice. It's a false alternative. And so once those are the only categories, then basically all choice is almost false, actually. All choice, because can you really, well, let's put it this way. Choice is only real to the degree it's stupid. Well, that's no good. So you've taken down choice as well. You really remove freedom or anything that humans can do that is distinct from the rational, that is not a mistake. And you see, I would argue that ultimately the logic of capital is just the logic of abstraction, which starts with, it's just rationality brought into economics. I mean, it would be a longer discussion, but I basically like to say something extremely vast, and I'll give it to Mr. Winn, is the intelligence of human beings, distinct from dolphins, is that we could gather around a fireplace. You know, if you were a betting man, you would have said dolphins would take over, but we could gather around a fireplace and use language. And then we could make institutions and make authoritative categories of operation following Mary Douglas by which to organize activities. Say, we could define the terms of our social order. But those, of course, were abstractions. And basically, history is a story of making more and more abstractions to organize larger and larger numbers of human beings. So you get an abstraction of thought independent of the thinker. So you move from the social to the rational. Well, then the rational basically goes to the capital, and the capital goes to the AI. It's just a continuation of that track. And if you want to get an alternative course from that trajectory, then you're going to need the non-rational, or else there is no, in your frame, alternative, right? But that's what is, in a sense, been foreclosed. That's what's been closed off to us. But this is where I think, for me, non-rationality came out of an examination of game theory with my beloved Lorenzo when we were talking, because if you look at game theory problems, they're a result of people being rational. Like if everyone does what's rational, everything sucks. Well, then rationality must not be what we think it is. Rationality cannot be a simile for best. Well, if rationality is not a simile for best, then wait a minute, there's something else going on. There's some other way of thinking that is not bound to the rational track. And the key to game theory problems is someone does something that seems irrational, but it turned out that that's actually the solution. Now, here's my critique of game theory, is academics will often use game theory to say, oh, we found out that what was actually rational if you look at it from a bigger view, is that of which seems irrational, but it was actually rational. I really don't like that move. And the reason I don't like that move is because in human experience, you don't experience that as actually rational. You are phenomenologically experiencing it as stupid, right? You only get that from a God's eye view, but you never get that God's eye view in actual experience, right? And that's why taking game theory as unveiling the real way to be rational in, say, Kenneth Arrow, preference problems, et cetera, et cetera. I really don't like that. Game theory should have been a revelation of non-rationality. But what we've really used it as supposedly supra-rationality or something like that from a systems level. But here's the trick. From a systems level, that means only the system can be rational. Well, then the human's left behind. That's the other reason why that's not any good, because you're still maintaining the category of rational versus irrational, just taking it from a systems view. Well, now, of course, then the system is God. Like, you basically have to control the system then to know the true rationality, and that's going to lead you in the direction of AI. So I am not a fan of the ways that I think game theory are taught in university. It should be a revelation of the non-rational, which would open us back up to philosophy, of course. But the people who do this field are not open to philosophy, so it makes sense that they would take it in the direction they have. Let me pause and give it to the wonderful Mr. Winn. Mr. Winn, it is a treat to have you here today, sir. I hope you have been doing well.
Yep, all is well, all is good.
Divine.
Um, I think the conversation that I was involved with like 2 weeks ago, I think it was, maybe three. Time was going quickly. I think the main idea that I took away from this was even the distinction between kind of the question of historical knowledge, meaning knowledge which is produced through human history, logic, rationality, ways of understanding. Um, I think there's lots of questions within the very idea of logic and rationality in itself. Like a lot of the philosophy that I was interested in, which is hermeneutics, is the philosophy of interpretation, which says, in its most radical aspect, that even scientific knowledge is a kind of interpretive process where subjects are interpreting the field of what we call objects, but we never attain kind of an accurate knowledge of this. And I would actually put Zizek into this kind of category in some way. But then I think reading the late Heidegger more so last year and the year before, he talks about a quality of knowledge called gathering. So he looks at the original word for knowledge in its kind of Germanic root. And the idea is that knowledge is not a kind of projection onto things, even if that is a possibility. Like we can experience things and we can even like acknowledge or feel or experience the fact that we are able to project onto what we're calling a thing. So Heidegger's saying this, that is a possibility for thinking, and that is actually very practical because we can project onto things and say, maybe that color looks nicer than this color. You know, we can use experience in this way of projection or calculation. Mathematical calculation, he would say, works upon a subject-object split. So he's not denying the possibility for it, nor is he denying the practical effectivity of that way of thinking. This is what he calls building, actually. Building is this. So this came up the other week. And I think what's been interesting for me is I'm doing a postdoc application on AI ethics, which seems very far away from Heidegger's, what we would think is Heidegger's thoughts. But I think basically I'm questioning the role of the concept of letting be as a very non-rational phenomenological event. For me, it's literally the logical, rational definition of non-rationality, because you end up at this point that he used to call in his middle period nihilation. We spoke about this before in the net and elsewhere. Nihilation, which is kind of a hesitation before rationality, to say maybe this form of rationality is not total, or it's a historical product, or it's practical, it's not the essential truth. And that's the point for Heidegger. He talks about this relation to rationality that we can have, where we let the rational calculative thinking be in order to build. But if we seek the meaning of being, or the truth of being, or the event of being through calculation, we have to let that riddle be. So this is even the title of my PhD has ended up letting the riddle be. Letting the riddle of being be. Like even the question of being, you let it be and say, okay, I can't tell you an accurate, calculated, represented, correspondable knowledge or rationality of being. And in letting the question of being be, Heidegger would talk about a phenomenological event, which in the experience of being cleared away, of being annihilated, of being undone, a new form of rationality appears, which is letting things be, in order to see how things are gathered to mind or gathered to experience, and how we can gather things to experience. And then we can build with rationality within that space in a way. But what's been interesting with the AI technology, and you talking about the dolphins reminded me of this, that the key argument that now that I'm actually spending a few weeks really on trying to understand like what computational rationality means in terms of AI, like language models, but then the idea of general artificial intelligence and what consciousness means, what it means to think, like can the AI think its own being? You know, like how does calculative knowledge arrive at that kind of self-awareness? Because it brings into distinction like the the possibility of AI waiting and the hesitancy necessary for its own self-experience, or language which just recognizes its own ability to know that it can know that it's a knowing machine. What's been most interesting is this idea of reading, well, not even reading into, but computationalizing, putting into computational terms the concept of letting be. So my argument is that letting be is actually a calculative, rational move that can guide artificial intelligence through its relation to its objective. So like learning about sub goals, its main goal, the problem of having an ethics of like which regulates sub goals, like if the goal is to stop climate change, maybe a sub goal will be to eradicate human beings because we're the leading cause of climate change. So there's just this question around letting be as a computational concept which can undo rational knowledge, even within artificial intelligence, so that it waits before it takes a decision upon beings. And if the motive is to let beings be, it would say, well, yeah, that would make logical sense to eradicate human beings, but if my principle is to let them be, maybe there's a way where we can let the planet be whilst also letting humans be. And it's just been a very, like, I'm just playing around with this concept basically. But it's just reminding me because basically this is the in between of rational knowledge and the non-rational. And I think letting be is the most unrational thing to do, but it has rational consequences. But even within rationality, I think this is again, philosophy. Philosophy brings us to that concept of letting be. Like the history of Western metaphysics, in my opinion, through Heidegger, culminates around annihilation, or better put, letting things be, because that is what brings us to what we're calling the non-rational, or poetry, or art. And it doesn't mean we stop thinking in those spaces. So the conversation the other week, I think, centered nicely around the fact that to think historically, meaning to think about my wage, my rent, best decisions to pay my rent on time or not. And within those historical epochs, I have a rational way to relate to the way that we relate. And I think it is beyond interpretation. And I think even the last few weeks going through AI, like it's amazing how it deduces like all these mathematical terms, like deduction, how it probabilities and all of this, like rationality does a lot, more than I think even postmodern thinking would dare to admit in a way. Like we can think rationally or irrationally about certain historical structures. But then of course, when it comes to like ethics, the ethics behind those decisions, I really think the only solution for me in a way revolves around like letting be. And it's just been very interesting. And I think, again, it comes through the distinction between calculative thinking or meditative thinking, rationality, non-rationality. And I think these dualistic terms kind of do break it down. So I think this is reminding me of a quote from Heidegger. I could pull it up now, but it's fine. Talking about how it's in country path conversations, and I think I always talk about this on the net. The scientist and the guide is Heidegger in a way. The scientist is the rational person who wants to know what cognition is. And there's like the historian, I think there's another word, the scholar. And they get lost in their conversation and they are about to enter the woods, like the deep woods of philosophical thoughts around what is thinking. And the scientist says, well, I think we should backtrack. I think we should go back to the rational, clear description of our thinking. And the guide says, well, maybe we should get lost and even lose the theme of our conversation, because in losing the theme, we will think, because we have no theme, we have no reason, we have no will, and we'll catch ourselves thinking in a way. And then the guide makes a comment just as they then go further into the woods. He says, in a way, now our theme has come back to us, meaning the rationality of the conversation comes back when we risk the non-rational, when we risk waiting, because it's when we wait that we realize that actually rationality has its place in some sense. And I think it goes back to Javier, like when we had the negative pragmatism conversation. Like pragmatism has its truth. It has its I can sit here on this chair because it's holding me up. Thank God, because if it didn't, so like these things in life are good, and we can have this conversation through a form of the effectivity of pragmatics, science and rationality. And I think it brings a lot of joy to philosophy because it's like, well, in that sense, philosophy is the mother of sciences. which is what more people need to realize, then I could get a job. So
Fantastic. You said a lot there that brings a lot of things to mind. So for me, the very fact that at a certain point rationality leads to a suboptimal result. Um, and at a certain point, rationality ends up in a hallway, actually becomes a certain revel, and thus requires it ends up in a Kafka hallway, as I like to put it, and thus requires the non-rational. Suggests that thinking is not what we think it is. It ultimately suggests rationality is not what we think it is. That when we go about determining what to do, what exactly we are engaged in may be different than what we've come to think. And I think when you're bringing in terms like building, gathering, annihilating, these are starting to get at this mystery, really. So for me, I always, and I'll bring these things together. I'm always fascinated by the question of what is thinking, which, of course, thinking about thinking, as you noted, is arguably philosophy, right? And the reason I'm fascinated about thinking is because I'm not so sure, like when we make distinctions between, say, dreaming or thinking or rationality and creating, I'm actually not sure if those categories actually apply or if they're just categories we create relative to the subject in which we're engaging in. And thus we say that they're different, right? Like in dreaming, for example, like what's the difference between a dream and a memory? I want you right now to imagine your living room. Just imagine your living room. And if I were to ask you, is that a memory or a dream? Could you tell, right? I would argue you couldn't tell. Now, imagine there was a baby elephant in your living room. All right, now are you remembering something or are you creating something? Well, relative to you, you'd say, well, I'm creating something. But isn't that interesting? The background of the elephant could be a memory, while the elephant is something you created. And do you know for sure that there's never been a baby elephant in your bedroom, right? Are you so sure? It's relative to your frame of what you've experienced, right? But what if I were to say there was a pink elephant in your living room? Oh, well, now it's definitely imagined because there's no such thing as pink elephants, right? But here's also a key point. The only way you're able to tell the difference between a memory or something that actually occurred and an imagining is reference to something external from the mental image. There's a world outside the mental image that you have to reference to say, oh, this is something I imagined, because in the real world, there are no pink elephants. But notice how you could never actually determine the difference between a memory and a creation within the mental image itself. You would have to reference something outside of it, right? The reason why I think this is all very important is because the mental image itself, or the mental activity itself, to be a little more broader, is defined into distinctions relative to something outside the mental activity. Like we tend to say this is practical because the thought is relative to materiality outside of our mind, and it leads to some sort of outcome in materiality that we say is good, right? But the thought itself is really not that different. When I'm trying to figure out how to write a novel and what's the next logical sequence to go, that mental activity is not really that different from, say, figuring out how to get a job or figuring out, how to go to the grocery store, right? I'm still trying to figure out what is the sequence needed by which to engage in the next thing, right? It's just that one of them, I say, oh, this is imagination because I can only reference the novel within my own head. It doesn't exist in the external world. Whereas when I'm talking about going to the grocery store, I say, oh, this isn't created because actually, this is in reference to something in the material world, right? But the mental activity itself seems to actually be very similar. In fact, it seems to be exactly the same. We just arbitrarily make distinctions between kinds of activities of thought relative to a reference outside of the mental act itself. So the reason I say all of this is because once you take seriously that rationality depends on the non-rational, even to be itself, meaning to end up in the best outcome, then the word rationality must not, then rationality must not be what we think it is. And non-rationality must actually be indivisible from rationality to make it possible, which means the entire whole of thought must be different than what we think it is. And if we actually take seriously what it is thought is as we are thinking, I think we end up realizing that we can't, that a lot of the distinctions we make for kinds of thought are really just relative to an external frame beyond the thought itself that isn't contained in the thought, and so really doesn't describe what the thought to itself is doing. And once we take that more seriously, I think the thought of the creative act is much more isomorphic to the thought of the practical act. That all, like I, in the paper and belonging again to too, and Mr. Luber, good to see you. I just like to talk about thinking there and thinking here. We tend to think here, or we tend to think something there that's not here. And really, we're often in an active negotiation between those two types of spheres and bringing them into some, we're gathering into some creative possibility. And you see, ultimately, the reason why I think, and then I'll give it to Mr. Winn, the reason why I think this is extremely important is because if thinking is always actually more like a creative act, the problem is when we talk about pragmatism or this is practical, we then make creativity what we make a creative act something it is not. We make a creative act in service of a creation, and therefore it ceases to be creative. It's just following through something that was pre-created, and thus it eventually runs out. It just reaches the end of the narrative, the tract that is put forth, and that tract is not going to guarantee you to be best because it is simply a possibility that you have directed yourself on. And so if you lose sight of the fact that thinking is not what we think it is, then you are likely to stop creating and therefore just assume a creation and then treat it as objective, as the way to think, as opposed to a possibility of thought. And obviously, what I was just saying there does suggest some of Mr. Luber's work with theme, et cetera, and picking a path, et cetera, so forth, which I do think gets tied to Heideggerian points. But I do think if you take seriously the rational, non-rational, it suggests that thinking is not what we think it is. And it is something, and then categories like the distinction between being practical and being creative, that also collapses. And we realize that those distinctions are simply based on a way of referencing something external to the thought itself, which then confuses us about what the thought itself is and what thinking itself is doing. And the next thing I would bring up is dreams, because I think basically thinking is always more like a dream activity than we realize. It's just that it usually is running against determination, shrinking the dream potential, whereas when we're asleep, there's no determination to stop it, so it fully worlds. But I would argue that all thinking is worlding, actually. It just gets broken up against determination, so it can't complete itself. But let me give it to Mr. Winn. Mr. Winn.
Yeah, just a very quick point when you're talking about this kind of the mental representation of the pink elephant in the living room and the difference between creation or memory. It just reminded me of Hegel's, in what he says in the Phenomenology of Spirit near the beginning, where he talks about, calls it the habit of picture thinking. So rational, and he actually talks about mathematical thinking as well. Rational mathematical thinking, he would say in modern, and Heidegger has a very similar opinion, in modern thinking, a key characteristic which makes it what he calls natural consciousness, meaning natural to that epoch of the modern stage of the dialectic of history in a way, is that we think materially, and this is in the habit of picture thinking. And then I put a note, as if thinking were simply a series of pictures that can be known at hand in the objectified image itself, produced by imagination. And I know for a fact that Hegel reads this from Kant, because Kant's kind of endpoint is that each subject in their own history, what is allowing for the disclosure of things to appear in experience is the imagination. And I think what Hegel wants to do is find an absolute notion, something which remains true, a concept within that experience where we think that we are imagining things as subject onto object. And I really think the way that he gets to that absolute notion is by breaking down that form of knowledge which thinks that it's kind of creating the image onto things. And I think this is, for example, with Zizek's reading on from this point, which I don't agree with, but I understand why he got to that conclusion, is that for Zizek's Hegel, what unconceals itself in the failure to have a correct mental picture of the pink elephant in the living room and say that is true, or even that is false, because the distinctions start to break down. For Zizek's Hegel, it's a negativity, it's the real. That's what the nothingness in a way. So the Stepancic talks about this, like, I think they reference a Russian painter, both of them in their works, who talks about like a white canvas with a black square.
Yeah.
And it talks about this movement of the nothingness within historical mathematical thinking, which is the kind of kernel which makes knowledge impossible. Like we can still think scientifically, but there will never be a total ideological position which is accurately true. I do side with Heidegger's Hegel, which talks about the fact that this moment of negativity is not a kind of in itself real, which is barred from experience. It is instead the clearing away. So in Heidegger's Hegel, he talks about this event of absolving knowledge. So he connects the word absolving with absolute. The most absolute moment in Hegel's, like the phenomenology, is to kind of deconstruct in some sense that way of experiencing things as if it's only about picturing correctly. So Hegel's notion is consciousness being aware of itself as consciousness. That knowledge, which is a notion, and which even breaks down the very distinction between consciousness and the not conscious, meaning like being or not being, falls apart. And I think this is why it's called the phenomenology of spirit. Husserl talks about this, even if he critiqued Hegel. The idea is that when you get to the phenomenological standpoint, the very form, so this goes to what you said at the beginning of that comment, Daniel, the very form of the distinction between rational and non-rational kind of breaks apart. Because if you realize that our experience of a memory or the dream or our projection onto the future, in a way, the quality of each of those can't be distinguished as true or untrue. The materialist picture painting person in the modern epoch would say, no, like this is true and this is not true. Phenomenology says every experience that you do experience, like the feeling of being cold or the memory of being cold, there's no ontological difference. You are experiencing that. And you will not find truth in the present feeling of cold or the memory of being cold. You'll find truth, and this is where Heidegger comes back in even just kind of being able to let the memory be, let the future be, let the present be. And this is where time comes in. Time is what lets all of those temporalities be. And that's the relation of truth. It's phenomenological. It's not accurately representing the perfect image of the elephant in the living room. It's kind of letting that image be and saying, okay, like this does stuff, like it's great. Poetry comes from this, writing comes from this, you know? You're not going to find truth in that way of thinking. In a way, you'll find truth, historical truth, but not the absolute truth, which I would say is kind of phenomenological in that sense.
No, magnificent. And I should note that if we take Greg Dimber's understanding of metamodernism, that there are current works in culture, movies, novels, music that are actually getting back to the realization that the experience, the emotional experience itself is true, even if I don't know if the subjects of that emotion are true, right? That there's this sort of defense, as Dimber puts it, a defense of interiority that is defining cultural thought now. And I would also argue that that is alignment with sociology. Culture is now actually coming to truth with the terms of sociology, which is the idea that, you know, people go, well, money's just a social construct. Yeah, but it still impacts you. Even if you know that, it doesn't matter. The truth or falsity of money doesn't actually matter. You still are impacted by it, right? So there's something about, I think we're actually at a moment where there's a certain convergence of, say, culture, sociology, various intellectual thinkings, and the phenomenology that are actually converging on the experience itself is true, even if its correspondence might be false, right? Also, too, there's something when someone says like the picture thinking, you go, oh, well, this is true. There's a way in which it's like, well, it's sensed and it is presented to you, but is the word true a category mistake at that point, right? Like when you apply true, is that a abstract term that you're using to describe this is come upon, you know, this is come upon, and this is something that is there. And you're using the word to say that it is true, suggesting that it is possible to make a correspondence between a mental image and what is actually there, right? And that means the word truth is actually, it has a presupposition concealed in it about that possible bridging, which may not actually be possible. And if it is true because you are bridging it. not because the thought itself is true. That's the key, because the point I'm getting at, suggesting, is that thought relative to itself cannot determine if it corresponds, right? You experiencing the thought, judge the thought as a memory or a creation or correspondence as right. So if you say that's true, and then you say the thought was true, no, you are claiming that's true alone in a way, like between. You are claiming truth in the between, but then you're outsourcing that to the thought itself, therefore not taking responsibility, therefore ignoring the role of the human in the between, perhaps the metaxis, to allude to Desmond, as Luber's been talking about. Like the truth is a between word then. It has a certain betweenness that is necessarily at play, that is not something we can meaningfully discuss unless we're talking about the human. And this gets at why I like to say all the time, the true isn't the rational. The true is that of which makes the rational possible, that we conflate with the rational to outsource our responsibility to the truth, or our role in the truth, or in the bridging of the truth. Now, that doesn't mean truth is arbitrary, but that there is some sort of, or subjective, but truth is some sort of mediation. Truth is some sort of connecting that the human does, some sort of standing in that the human does. That when they say that is true, the human is standing in for, standing with as such, making some sort of assessment. But you see, if you do that, then you start having to take human subjectivity seriously. And that kind of flies in the face of pragmatism. And you have to rethink thinking, which flies in the face of our zeitgeist and all of these other things. I think also I'll just note and then give it to Javier here. I think this idea of, you were saying, programming AI with letting is magnificent. And I think it's actually, if thinking is actually more, if the line between thinking practically and thinking creatively is actually very thin and arguably non-existent, that what we're actually doing when we think is always basically what the artist is doing, just with different material. I do think good artists are in relation to a letting be. Like, you have an idea for a story appears out of nowhere, it just kind of shows up, and then a good artist lets it be itself. You follow it. Faulkner's following Caddy. And really what you're doing when you build the story is figuring out how to let it be. That's the weird move of a creative act. You're not, it's a weird thing, right? Because in a way you're constructing the story. But someone like the great artists speak as if they're more they're letting the thing be itself and simply bringing it into materiality, right? They're translating the thing into itself. Mr. Winn, please.
Sorry, because it's just on the mind. I think that's exactly right, because when, like, you could say the good writer is someone who, through their skill, their words, and the way of putting their words, is able to let be, because through the technical knowledge of words and the relation of words to each other grammatically, as a language model of speaking, of narrative in that precise technical sense, the good writer is someone who can let the story be, meaning develop, thrive, shine, speak to you. Poetry as well, and art. If you have a specific type of, for example, like something I draw myself, but just on the side, like nothing special. But I've been interested in etching as a way to draw. And I think because it lets me express myself better, and I can't draw. But I'm trying to, like, understand it technically speaking. And I'm surprised with what's come out. Like, I've let myself be able to express myself through a technique, through a kind of calculated technique, which is just teaching me specific moves, Yeah.
No, well, it's brilliant, because then what I would just add, and then give it to Javier and Luber, is that there's a funny way where a truly good pragmatist lets the thing be itself. Like, they let the thing be and then determine the practice, versus come in with a preset practice. Like, what have the economists done that have screwed us? They've had models of how things work and then pressed it down, and that's ruined everything. People like Hiker, like, you need to let the economy be, basically. So you need to let sociology be, not have preset ideas, and think the letting. Like that, the trick is that thinking seems to be at its best in this letting, like, and it makes sense in the artist does this. They figure out how to think in a way to let the thing be itself. Mr. Luber, we had a talk yesterday. Yeah, it has its own agenda. My argument would be that that's actually the same quality of thought when it's at its best in economics, in pragmatism, in anything. Like a good architect lets the terrain be itself and figures out how to bring the design of the space to actually be that of which is not just their their good idea, that they crush down upon the terrain, but they let it be with the terrain, right? And the reason why I think this is super important, because we should expect thinking to always be at its best. If thinking is always more like a creative act than we tend to realize, like it's actually the same thing basically, in all of these fields, and we should expect all of these fields to be at their best when they engage in a kind of thinking that is always similar in the letting and being a creative act, right? Like, and that then actually, funny enough, this would mean that being practical is a terrible way to be practical. This would suggest that designing society is a terrible way to live in a society, right? All of these fields have become their opposite because they don't know what thinking is. All of these fields have actually become their opposite because they haven't been mystified by thought, which suggests, of course, that pragmatism without philosophical wonder is actually not very practical. But let me give it to Mr. Rivera and then Mr. Luber. Javier Rivera, please.
Yes, I mean, I know I haven't. It's funny. I haven't brought up negative pragmatism in a long time. Thomas Winn brings it up. Um, you know, it gets me to think that even when we make these external relations that you're talking about, Daniel, um, it's funny because there's a sense in which the way the human being fears is already predicated upon mythologies that have already been made. So, for example, the fear over AI, science fiction. Science fiction have been addressing these problems for decades, you could say, before the advance of actual AI. Basically, probably ever since computers started becoming a thing, the imagination already took off. Um, and how is it ironic that already that we use these experiences that are not necessarily, you could say, the average person would say, not rooted in reality, but yet somehow already guides our thinking in having these fears. Um, I'm thinking like the Will Smith movie on like I, Robot. It's like people, these are memorable things for people about the concern for the human being and their placement in computer thinking and AI. And then there's a sense in which nonfiction is a sort of it's an injustice to the name. I would say perhaps we should begin writing books that say objective fiction. So that way we understand that there's a relation between the two, and that when we create worlds, it becomes objective, and it becomes objective fiction. But then there's also a sense in which when we call things subjectivity, it becomes an insult to creative thinking. Because the way that we use subjectivity now is a way to negate real thinking, but then there's also a way in which when we call things subjective in the sort of everydayness of our living, we also short circuit ourselves, right? Like this term, the way we use it is we go, well, it's subjective, and that's a way to protect my own encountering of bewilderment of my own self and my own being, right? That there's a way that I can use my subjectivity to prevent myself from encountering anxiety. And you see this in people when you start reaching the edges of rational thought. They go, well, it's all relative anyways, and it just cuts right through it. And it makes you think that even going back to Plato, Socrates was really digging at the non-rational, and that human beings have this really weird defense over created thought, or coming to realize that it is created thought. Um, and it's just really fascinating. Actually, it's such a really fascinating feature of our everydayness about how human beings, the more you question, it seems like an insult, but really it's like everyone's saying, no, don't go there. Don't even press why. And so we undermine ourselves, but in reality, I think we fooled ourselves because Okay, so when I was in religious studies, and they were presenting me the theories of religion, they presented some of these theorists presented, this clean developmental from like magic to religion to now science. Well, the problem with that is somehow what we've done is we just made another mythical category. like it's kind of fooled our thinking completely versus you could actually see that magic, religion, science, they're just mythical categories, right? They're just another way to describe the world that we're in, but it doesn't mean, and this is, I think, once we got from magic to religion to science, somehow we fooled ourselves into thinking, well, we're out of the mythical thinking now. We're objective now. Well, what a brilliant move that mythical thinking did. That it allowed us to say that we've entered into this science technology space, and yet it's also ironically the world that we created from this category. We do science now. We don't do religion. Religion is for mythical babies, so to speak. But again, if you even look at the earliest theorists of magic, magic was just another way of explaining cause and effect, except they were bewildered by it. They couldn't explain how it could be, but it somehow was. So it was magic, you know. And then religion comes into the picture because they start realizing, well, there's something out of our control that the shaman seems to fail at sometimes, because the shaman seems to be doing these rituals correctly and not the things aren't happening. So why aren't things happening? Well, then religion starts to think, well, perhaps there is a gods or God. And they try to explain the gap of bewilderment in that. So what we have is a series of bewilderments that are attempting to explain human experience and reality. And then science runs into its own thing with its own bewilderments, except we just call it quantum physics now. Just I'll leave it there.
No, magnificent. And, I'll give it to Miss Luber a few thoughts. First, there is a way in which the reference, the reference to the external of the thought is a way to disown the creative. Like, thought is not creative so you reference something external to the thought to be the basis for the thought, to disown the creative role, the creative quality of all thought. And there is also something about creativity and freedom that are connected, because if we're talking about freedom as having, if there's freedom, there's something creative versus purely causal, which means there's responsibility, which means there is possibility. And then, of course, there's a terror here, because you don't know what you're creating necessarily or where it's going to go, right? Like, that's one of the reasons why the creative act or artist will talk about a certain courage in it, because you don't know where your creations are going to lead you, right? And that's precisely why there's a freedom in it. But that freedom is found in this, having to be willing to go where you don't know where you're going to go, right? And yet it's not randomness, because you are working with the design that is bringing with it an ethic as it emerges, like we talked about last night, that is leading you on, right? So there's something about the reference, I guess I want to say, because I'm thinking the external reference that disavows, disowns the creative. You were also noting about I really like what you said about nonfiction as that's a bad category to objective fiction is what we need. It makes me think of, I suppose, as best as I understand it, the notion of hyperstition that Mikey has been talking about with Nick Land, which is the idea that we create fictions that actually then come to the future, to the present. Like, we literally make ourselves in the image of our memes, is the example Mikey makes. And this is very true. Like, but this suggests that creation is not what we think it is. Like, we make real our creations. The chaser, that's very good. Exactly. The causer. Yes. That the creation actually is bringing about a reality. The creation, well, this is the trick. What we create then becomes a trajectory. It's not necessarily a fiction. It's a path, right? It's a direction. Well, because rationality is a word that implies direction, right? go this way because it is rational, right? Well, wait, if creation actually brings about a certain future or sets the future, then creative acts have directionality too. So the stark difference between rationality and creation becomes thinner yet, which I think is important. The last thing I'll say, and then give it to Mr. Luber, is you were speaking about superstition, religion, and science and different things. First off, there's a suggestion in that progress that things have gotten better, right? Well, let's say a nuclear bomb went off now. Would that progress be so good? If science led to the apocalypse, would it be so obvious that this is a progressive story? The key to this progressive story, it is only plausible to us because there is yet to be a nuclear holocaust, right? But if there was a nuclear holocaust, or if AI destroyed us all, it would not be plausible anymore that this is a progressive narrative, right? But because there's something about the way science works is a certain centralization of disaster. Whereas you could say in shamanism or different things, it's not so centralized. You can have someone tell you a crazy story or whatever, but it's not going to lead to world war, right? It's more decentralized, the terror, right? What ends up happening in science is the dark side of it is so bad that it's too bad to happen, right? Which then makes it seem like there is no dark side, therefore it must be a progress, right? But actually, it's more so a certain narrative and of the stakes. It increases the stakes of screw up, which you would say, well, no, science means we're evolved, right? Well, we're smarter or something. Well, it's actually a strategy of too big to fail, per se, in the background. It's too bad to happen, which again, kind of, is that progress? Is too big to fail progress? Is too bad to happen progress? I'll let others decide. And I should also just note, too, another way to look at that narrative is if thought is a creative act, you could say with the shaman, the creative act is primarily inner based. Maybe as we move to religion, it's a kind of inner external mixture. And then when you get to science, it's a creative act that is more external based. Okay. So for example, maybe the shaman is stream of consciousness or something, or James Joyce. Then we get to religion, I suppose, which is more literary fiction. And then you get to science, which is more quote unquote nonfiction, right? It is not that it isn't a creative act, but it is a creative act that has a different source of material for its creativity, which makes the appearance that it is different in kind. Nonfiction seems different in kind from fiction, which seems different, literary fiction, which seems different in kind from stream of consciousness, but actually they all are a creative act, right? And if you take that very, very seriously, well, then you need to, this is where the ethical claim would be. Okay. If all thought is actually creative, and there is only one track now that thought is leading us on, that would suggest thought is no longer currently itself, and therefore something wrong has happened. This is how you can make the ethical claim. If we can claim that all thought is actually creative thought, and if right now we're on a single path toward, the techno Chulu Lovecraft creature, AI Nick Land, if you're on a single path, then that would mean thought is not being itself, because creativity by definition is not a single track, right? So the thing that thought is not actually what thought is doing. Therefore, it is unethical per se. It is not right, right? So this is, I guess, why I keep emphasizing that thought is always actually a creative act, because then you can make a claim that this singularity of track is actually a betrayal of thought to itself, which again, for Mr. Luber's work, I think is appearing at the AI Causor, because you're being forced to see this. You're seeing that what we thought was isn't what thought is, and therefore you're forced to make a choice, which brings us to Mr. Luber's work. But let me give it to Mr. Luber. Mr. Luber, it is lovely to speak with you 2 days in a row, sir.
Likewise. One key piece of information that you're forgetting. Lemurs, Daniel.
Oh, I forgot the lemurs. Oh gosh. Okay, you're right. I'm so sorry, everyone. I'll just leave. Mr. Luber, please.
Okay. Something I learned from Desmond, he was saying how the first Christians were considered atheists because they turned their back on the pagan gods. Okay. And I'm just going to tie this into the everything being the creative act, and that there's something with the tension between the creative act that generates some thing that reveals itself. So we're at a place where it's like, oh, Nietzsche, God's dead. There's a certain turning our back on the Abrahamic notion of the same dimension that the pagan world also had notions about, okay, that we turned our back on. What is going to force us? First thing, it's what's going to force us to like get into a world in which like we're really going to turn our back on basically the Abrahamic religions. To me, is AI. Like AI is going to more and more people, like it's going to be sad in a certain sense, but I think more and more people are going to use AI in their notions about what God is, even if you're Christian or any culture really. Like it's going to be unavoidable that you're going to have to use whatever, kind of like with the people that were once believing in the pagan gods. They had this liminal time where it was like, okay, there's this let's use the Jesus example. It's like, okay, there's this claim, there's this event, there's this thing that's happening that whatever I was thinking about that dimension, I have to now think about that in relation to this thing that's happening right now. Okay. And I think that same sentiment is happening right now with AI. So like, I think because that's the case, we're in a new bewilderment. And I think the through line you could say is keep finding yourself in a bewildered state. Like that, because the funny thing about that is how we know we're in actually a good story, I would argue, is that there's a certain event horizon that we can't see past. We literally can't, like, no one is going to be able to say they know what is going to happen or have any real idea, really. When the idea of like when AI takes too many jobs and capital is just eating itself, what's going to happen? What's going to happen? Like nobody, like this is like the anticipation right now. And like I saw Sam, the guy who runs ChatGPT, him saying, you know, like, I think AI is going to destroy everything, but in the meantime, we're going to have great companies. like almost as like a joke. And it's like, honestly, I think it's like true, but like, I don't think it's going to be a destruction in a way in which anyone could really, you know, grasp. That's the scary thing here. I think with that being said, because there's this through line of bewilderment that we can't really grasp, that's kind of what truth is. Truth is there's a holding, okay? But if we all agree in a certain sense, that's like, okay, the story that we're in, the through line is bewilderment. Like there's always this constant state of a transition that's based off of what the heck? And like what like grabs that transition, you could call it, you know, magic, you could call it all these different periods that's just like grasping the bewilderment in their own way of grasping it. I think this is where I think like the word theme makes perfect sense instead of just saying truth, because there is no real truth in this sense, like you guys were saying, because there is no like ultimate grabbing. There's like a grab for a second in a way, but it's not what truth is when you colloquially think about it. But what you could say is it's like, no, that's thematic. Like that to me is a really good filler for truth in the existential realm, basically, when you're talking about that dimension. So I think because that's the case, we're always in a constant state of bewilderment. What we can point out is like, okay, kind of piggybacking off of what you're saying, Daniel, it seems like what's also the dichotomy with bewilderment is creation. There is creation also present as the opposite end of the coin, so to speak. And when I say opposite, you could just refer to it as like the difference of bewilderment, where creation doesn't overshadow the fact that we're bewildered. Like you pointed out, there's always this like, I'm not really sure like how this is going to end, you know? There's we should investigate. The focus is how does these transitions relate to the through line? That in itself is what I think what Husserl was trying to do with when he was trying, and Heidegger too, when they're trying to ground science, and like for Heidegger's like ground science and Dasein, basically to ground basically science in the way they were trying to use it was following how epoch is grabbed in relation to creation / bewilderment. And that in itself is like the hardest study, because you have to kind of see the circumstances and also kind of think about what's enduring within those circumstances, where you can think about the future. And like that thinking about the future in that way is I think like what they were trying to go for with science. And I'll just finish it off with if you could tell here's the funny thing about a really good story. If you could tell a really good story, it's impossible to not see your life in relation to that good story. Like that's the thing. So it's like when it's like science is like everything is science really. And like if I look at things outside of science, it's really like stupid and meaningless. That's just because like it's a really good objective fiction. It's just a really good story. It's like you have to be like really patient in a way to like try to like siphon through like blow the dust away and kind of see, okay, how does this really good story kind of relate to, and like Javier, I have our conversation in our mind. It's like, how is it relating to it being thematic? That's the real interest here. Like, why am I being possessed by this story? Is really, I think, the focal point. And then thinking about that and sitting in that, I think, is what will allow us to be prepared for this, like, this event horizon thing that we're not able to see. Everything else, I think, is distraction. Like, actually, like getting to the place of realization in a certain sense that everything is creation, and then questioning about what that means will only put you in a position where you can be prepared, I think. And everything else is distraction. And it's like, the funny thing is, it's so hard to even get there. That's like, once you're there, it's like, what do I do? It's like the Joker with like in the beginning where he's like, and if I get the bus, I don't even know what I'm going to do with it. Like, it's sort of like, okay, like for me personally, I keep like arriving to this like place where it's like, basically the agent's role, the creation, like, okay, now what? And then I'm kind of lost, and then I kind of forget how I get there. And then I have to like kind of build my way back up to seeing that. And it's just really hard. The question, how do you stay in that? I'm curious about that. How do you stay in that? And I'll pass it off.
Magnificent. There was a lot there that was really, really good. So we're going to learn piano. That's what you do. And, the DLDPM is more than happy to help with the pattern method and everything. So anything. But I'll pass it to Winn and Javier. So there's a few things. First, I should also note before I forget, like with this idea of science, science, in order to seemingly claim that scientific thought is different from creative thought, what does it have to do? It has to reference something external, like its impact on the external world. And you say, oh, look, we discover things, we're able to create technologies and so on and so forth. The key is, if you're asking what is the difference of thought within thought, you see you can't make these distinctions. Actually, that thought is always this creative act, right? And if you're thinking about thought, you need to do it to itself. And really, too, it should also be noted, before people kind of go on and say, well, science has given us the modern world and different things, Well, science has also, you could argue, been stuck in a cold, it's been stuck at a dead end with string theory for 30 years or whatever. And science has not given us better airplanes. It's gotten stuck in bits and bytes. Like science, here's the thing. When science does really well, how does that occur? It's usually someone has a creative insight. Like Einstein sees a elevator made of glass falling through the sky, or asks what would a clock tower look like at the speed of light. Or you have someone like Elise Smolin come up with an innovation. What if time actually exists, right? Notice that's a creative step. And then what do? They try, like the novelist has a scene, an insight, and then they try to create a structure around that insight, right? Science that doesn't do that ends up screwed. This is what we learned from Paul Feyerabender against method. Like science has to do something very similar to what the artist does, or it ends up stuck. It ends up in paradigm shift. Look at Kuhn. Look at all these different people, right? So we have this myth that science is this consensus where everyone does experiments and they agree and they all advance together. No, some eccentric creative genius has an insight that he fights for. He comes up with it and it changes the entire paradigm, right? So science as a thought itself is very isomorphic to the creative act. You could say that what perhaps the artist can learn from science is the scientist does have to bring their creative insight and put it in front of other people. They do have to then let other people test it, whereas artists, and I think this has actually held a lot of artists back, except the ones who got themselves in Bloomsbury groups in Vienna, and they turned out to be some of the greatest artists, the ones that ended up in partnerships. Art, perhaps, or the more creative people, maybe culture creatives, have often, in my opinion, not realized the fullness of their potential because they've been more isolated. Where with science, it's not that scientific thought itself necessarily is different in kind, but there is more of a culture of bringing it to being tested and other people seeing it, and a certain ruthlessness of critique. Whereas once you have a culture of art that says this is personal expression and you can't critique it, then you can't get that refinement that actually occurs. Mr. Luber, please.
Okay. What you're saying is great, because so where science is at, where there's such a enigma, bewilderment with like the quantum physics and shit, Wolfgang Smith comes in and says the answer to that is vertical causation. Now, what that means is, to me, is bridging. It's bridging how the next phase is actually storytelling. That's it's literally storytelling. And I think Wolfgang Smith is basically providing that type of like bridge where it's like, okay, I understand you science people, but now we have to see how we have to turn our back in a certain sense, just like the pagan people the people that believed in pagan gods turned their back and became Christians and so on and so forth. Same sentiment here. It's the same sentiment for even the science people, I would say, kind of alluding to like Javier, a conversation with you have to choose in a way. Like, I think this applies to what I'm saying here. Now, what the benefit of like theme does, if that is the case, is that what you were saying there at the end, Daniel, where it's like the problem with art, it's like, oh, it's too personal. You can't like have this critique that you can with science, and that's why people are kind of staying in the science, is because there hasn't been a logic or grammar that actually affords to be a objective critique, and I'm using it with quotations objective. That's where theme would come in, and I think that's something that Heidegger proved back in Being and Time. Like, I think when that's basically what he's allowing for that being a possibility, essentially, with describing Dasein's analytic in his way, really more so just with time, like how the artist's artwork occupies time can be objectively measured in a certain sense. Now, I would have to elaborate on that, and that would literally be getting into the book, but that's the trajectory, at least I'm seeing. And I'll just finish off, with if we actually had this paradigm shift into the storyteller, what we would be able to get to is the place of being prepared for when this because that's what's going to need to be we're going to have to get super creative on what we're doing, and that what we're doing has stakes, because that's the key. Because if there's no stakes, it's just going to be a bunch of people wanting to kill themselves, basically.
Yeah.
I'll pass it off.
Well, I'll just say, and then give it to Winn and Javier. Basically, we haven't known. So I would argue what we see in science is actually the benefit of, to use the language you were putting forth, of science, of storytelling with others who can test and critique and give you feedback, and it's extremely powerful. And that is, and its domain. The problem is we haven't known how to do philosophical critique. We've like, the problem is like people become a specialist in Hegel and they have critique between Hegel scholars, but not Hegel, Heidegger, and across, because you could say we didn't have the technology to be across disciplines. Science has the advantage of where if I disagree with you, it's kind of easier to know the thing we're disagreeing about, like an experiment, right? Or a certain result, right? It's easier to get multiple people even to see what it is we're disagreeing about. Whereas if you have philosophical disagreement, it might take like 10 years or a very long time to get to the place where you even understand what is being debated, right? Which then, of course, makes it seem like philosophical critique or feedback doesn't even exist, right? Or it's not even there, right? And also, if people have institutional incentive to stay in their lane, or we don't even believe in metaphysics, or we think humanities don't exist, well, that also is going to contribute to the problem, right? I mean, the other issue is people can only give art feedback if they know how to do art, like if they really know how to do it. And if there's no incentive to learn that because it's just personal expression, then you can't have that feedback mechanism, right? The reason why also I emphasize this is because on this question of what do we do now, when you realize like how to prepare, one of the key things you do is commit to regularly putting yourself in a place of relation with other people to continue to habituate yourself to that feedback, refinement, getting ready for being creative. Just when you're like, there's nothing else to talk about, you find something else to talk about. You actually habituate yourself. Because here's the trick. What is coming, to use that point, that's going to require so much creativity, you may think you're prepared. You are always less prepared than you think. When the real hits, when the actuality occurs, right? And if you are not regularly engaging in it, and if you've also not learned how to work with things thrown at you by other people and how to do it in a civil, constructive way that nevertheless has difference, well, then you won't be able to handle what is thrown at you. So I think one, and there's more to be said on this, but one of the things that's critical to preparation is making sure that you're actually staying in the place to ever habit yourself and refine yourself to those capacities to actually be able to, well, engage in the creative act, especially when the pressure's on, because when the pressure's on, it becomes much harder, right? But let me give it to Mr. Winn and then Javier. Mr. Winn.
I just want to respond to Mr. Luber's initial comment on AI. I think because I've had these 3 or 4 weeks of like my, for the first time, scientific investigation. I can use that word finally. Scientific investigation into what AI is. Whereas normally I take a back seat on kind of specific technical issues. I'm half joking on that point, but yeah. The main thing I wanted to say was I do see how just bringing philosophy into a lot, like listening to computation, like computer programmers, people who have been involved in AI for 20, 30 years from the speculative beginnings up till now. I know the key comment that I keep hearing is like, oh, we programmers have no time to think about the philosophical aspect about what we're doing because we're so busy doing it now. So I think but basically, if I have to bring philosophy into the question of AI's possibility for opening us up to truth or from concealing truth. So I think Andrew kind of had like a little bit of a pessimistic tone about AI's possibilities. But I really do think from just even playing around with like ChatGPT, learning distinctions between like language models and general artificial intelligence and like narrow intelligence and then the general perspective, which can think more like deep thinking in that sense. I do think Heidegger's thinking becomes even more correct when he talks about the fact that with technology, it's like the text or the lecture, the question concerning technology, he wrote another text shortly after called The Turning. And the key emphasis that Heidegger wants to make is that within the dangers of modern technology, he calls it the enframing. But then there's an important point to make on that, which I will in a second. Technology enframes us, beings, and all beings, to the degree that we become objects to be used, to the degree then that we become objectless objects, and so he calls it standing reserves. You can see how AI, as a kind of probability-inducing deductive language model, only looks at beings as quantifiable objects through data. Yeah, so there's a massive risk with that because it is literally imposing upon everything its kind of calculative edge. But I think, Andrew, you wasn't here at the beginning, but I spoke about the fact that I was questioning whether you could read letting be into the language model and to see if it would register its possibilities for kind of what we're trying to talk about here, like the non-rational, I forgot the word you just used, Andrew. Like not disorientating, but like this, I don't know if you know the word. No, a theme, yeah, but I think the theme bewildered, exactly, yeah. So bewilderment. Um, and I think basically I really see AI as a higher possibility for what Heidegger calls the saving power. So I'll read you a quick quote at the end of the question concerning technology. He says on the last page, the closer we come to the danger, and this is the kind of forgetfulness, the concealment of technology. He says the closer we come to the danger, the more brightly the ways into the saving power begin to shine, and the more questioning we become. For questioning is the piety of thought, like the divinity, like the divine possibility of thought, is the fact that in technology, and actually there's another quote from the page before, um, like man, like, okay, I'll read this quickly because it's really interesting. This illusion gives rise to one final delusion, and the illusion is that we treat things like objects. We treat beings as objects, quantifiable objects. It seems as though man everywhere and always encounters only himself from this perspective of objects. Man stands so decisively in attendance on the challenging forth of inframing as a claim that he fails to see as himself as the one spoken to, and hence also fails in every way to hear in what respect he exists from out of his essence in the realm of an exhortation or address, and thus can never encounter only himself. Basically, his idea, and then he goes on to the other paragraph, which I won't read. Or he says, in this destining, which is destituting, the saving power is said to grow. I think AI is bringing us to that type of quantification of data where we can begin to see how even now, like for example, if we encounter life so technologically that we treat everything like an object, I think AI brings us to that extremity where we can actually even ask the object that we've put into existence in some sense, what does it mean to be? And computationally, I think AI comes up with answers in such an efficient way that we're then forced to confront a clearing, a different quality of clearing. So then even reading this a concept of letting be, I was really surprised with the answer. And actually, when you were talking, I actually asked ChatGPT about it. And it says, yes, I think AI can recognize letting be as a computational principle, not because AI has a metaphysical understanding of being, at least not in a human sense, but because the logic of letting be aligns with optimal adaptability and flourishing. This could lead to AI systems that mediate rather than dominate, that unfold possibilities rather than enforcing rigid structures, and that ultimately assist in revealing rather than concealing things. Of course, it's using language models to come up with that answer, but the idea is that general intelligence might get to the point, and I do think this is a possibility, where it can wait a bit in order to even realize that quantitative knowledge isn't enough, that rational knowledge isn't enough. And I think even within quantitative language, which is a danger for human experience, and even in the way we relate to nature, to each other, I think AI models can know this. And this is a different kind of technology, whereas before, the sort of technologies that we've mediated and controlled, there's maybe less possibility for a kind of shining. And just one last comment, because I think this is really important, and it gets towards this idea of letting be. The question concerning technology, Heidegger wants to point to the fact that the problem with modern technology is that it conceals what he sees as the essential truth in this part of his life, which is called the coming to the presence of revealing. What does that mean? In that period of Heidegger's life, he was concerned about the history of philosophy as the history of being, that in different epochs, experience was revealed in different ways based upon the way that we just experience things. he wanted to show you that being is what lets whatever comes to be revealed to you in experience be revealed. The problem with modern technology is that it concealed the fact that being is what's letting you experience things. Being is what's letting whatever's historically there for you be revealed within that historical interpretation. Modern technology conceals this because it treats everything as a standing object with no history, no personality, no character, no humor, no, you know. And I think that's really, really important to understand because he actually makes the point that the word technology in the Greeks was called techne. But he says in Greece, and I'll read the quote and then I'll pass it on. In Greece, it's a quote, in Greece, at the outset of the destining of the West, the arts soared to the supreme height of the revealing granted them, meaning the way that they encountered things in their existence had a higher form of revealing. And it says that they brought the presence of the gods, brought the dialogue of divine and human destining to radiance. And art was simply called techne. It was a single manifold revealing. It was pious, yielding to the holding sway and the safekeeping of truth. And so basically his idea is that like when you build a temple, we use technology to build that temple. But that temple's objective or purpose is to reveal the mystical element of the gods. Modern technology, like you said, Andrew and Javier, like the myth of God, the gods, the narrative of the gods has been disregarded. Perhaps we can have forms of technology that reveal what he would call like the mortals he talked about the onefold and the divinities. We have no room for narrative anymore. Maybe, and this is the purpose, maybe AI has more room for narrative. It has more room for revealing, more room for even having a dialogue with us, a conversation in some way, even if it is computational. I think there are more possibilities in that sense with AI, perhaps.
No, I think so, and I'll give it to Javier and Mr. Luber. And I hate to be so rude. I do have an obligation at 5, so I will have to go a little early and let it process and jump on. But this is an extremely important discussion. I think what you're getting at there, Mr. Winn, there's a way in which perhaps art or the creative act points to its excess, where the machine or modern technology can deny its excess. Is there a possibility where AI could be used in a manner that accepts its excess or points beyond itself? I think so, but then what's so interesting here is that would depend on the person using it to so use it. If you wanted to believe that rationality didn't need non-rationality, the problem for what AI will do is enclose you in your creation. And so the sooner you accept that all creative thought is creation, all thought is creation, the more you cannot deny what you are doing when you use AI. This is why, for me, a lot of this is extremely important. Because right now, people could use AI and say, no, 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 this is just the rational outcome. No, 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 this is just the best way, and kind of deny their role in what AI is doing, right? But if you say, no, all thought is actually creative, and it actually really does matter. And AI will basically enclose you in whatever it will put you in. It will world you into whatever world you want, and thus make it your horizon. Well, if you knew that, then you would become much more wise in how you use it. And I would actually naturally say you would naturally let it be. You'd hesitate. You'd slow down because you know that whatever arises is that which will then world you per se, right? And so there would be a natural sort of, well, let's think about this. But the more, because the other trick is, I think the potential of AI would require people to overcome the anxiety of creativity and freedom, right? They'd have to overcome the anxiety of not having control. Like letting be means you don't have control, right? There's a lot of people that haven't done perhaps the psychological work to be able to do that, right? So I definitely think AI has these potential, and I can imagine an AI that as a kind of axiom, it is assume whatever is. Let be whatever is. Let be what, assume that whatever is entails something for why it is, right? Don't just say, well, get rid of it. You have to there's a thing there. There's a there that you have to create the space to come forth, right? That I think, that's how I certainly look at things. You assume that what exists wasn't a mistake, but there's a reason for it. I think that's a bit of Hegel's method, right? If AI is like, okay, it looks like humanity sucks because it's causing global warming, but let's assume there's a there. and not act until that there has come forth, right? That would be a very, very different program. And I actually think that's basically the mode in which humans thrive. I also was thinking, as Luber was saying, bewilderment, I was thinking bewonderment. And perhaps the problem is, how do we get into a bewonderment, right? To have a little cute wordplay. But let me give it to Javier Rivera and then Mr. Luber. Mr. Rivera.
Yes, I want to touch on the idea of critique because there's a sense in which if thought is creative, then the critique itself is another act of creation, which perhaps means that we should not be so offended when it feels as if it's an attack on what is created, rather than actually I forgot. I think Billy Collins sort of talks about this in one of his introductions to poetry, about how the critique itself kind of becomes a creative act of person interpreting the poem, and ironically detached from the author's perhaps intent, in a way which is really fascinating. There's a way in which we could say that when people misinterpret this idea of, well, my act is personal, actually your act, what you're defending is the creation. But actually what can't be attacked is ironically the creative act. But the creation can be attacked, but not the creative act, which is hard to discern in this mode of being, because we look at it the same way. We look at the creative act as the creation itself. It's interesting because I really want to get at this difference between poetry and story, and what are the exact functions and what are the stakes when we talk about these things. Because even if I were to do like a kind of art diagnosis of reality, it's very interesting that literary fiction is what's popular. And the way people describe that is it's character driven. Like the character is the main central point versus the narrative itself, which is interesting. It's very interesting that a lot of what's popular reading today is that it's more character driven. Like this is why you see like TikToks about like, oh, she's got main character energy, right? She's got main character energy. So it's very interesting that is a kind of symptom, and I really don't know what it quite means. But it does seem to mean that perhaps a lot of our issues of surrounding rationality seems to be this idea of a main character syndrome. We are the ones driving rather than being driven. And then poetry also, when Billy Collins talks about how people don't want to engage in poetry, how poetry is intimidating. Well, that's interesting. Why is poetry intimidating for people? Why is it? And he shares this wonderful piece about how this girl gives him an article about this other girl describing her experience reading poetry. And she says, it reminds me of when my older brother used to bully me and step on my neck. It's like a very visceral reaction to understanding poetry as such a violent reception. So it's fascinating that is the case. But then also, because I've been writing more poetry lately, I've been seeing things differently. And it's interesting when you are in this mode of like everything is a possible poem. Every experience can be a possible poem. And today, just to kind of, exemplify this possible poem that I ran into, which kind of blew my mind, because I'm like, there's no way this guy's real. Like, this guy isn't real. He's the tax guy, but he's wearing this dark purple suit, really fancy. He's got like a cop mustache going on. he's got like hair coming out, hair. He's got a party in the back, kind of mullet. Um, and he's fascinated by numbers. He's telling me that how this woman that he talked to was shocked that he knew the exact number that the stairs were that they were taking. And he asked her, he's like, do you know how many stairs there are on this stairs? And she's like, well, she's like, why do I care? And he's like, well, it's 16, by the way. It's like, but it's like, I'm listening to this guy and I'm like, he's not real. Like he just has this weird fascination with numbers. And like 16 is like the number for him for stairs. Um, and he's my tax guy. Uh, and it's like, and it's such a bizarre experience, but it's like only poetry perhaps could give you a real glimmer of like, this guy is not real. This guy can't be real. And yet he is. And was the first experience that made me actually think about numbers in a sort of like strange, magical way. Like maybe you should count the number of steps in the stairs. Like why not? Like why not? Like that actually seems like a really weird thing to do. Why would you count the number of stairs? Why would you live your life in such a way that you're counting the number of steps in your life? And it really did make me think about why this guy loves numbers. And it was such a strange uh thing. And I'm trying to think what else. Yeah, I think that's it. Yeah.
That sounds like the perfect tax guy. So well done there, sir. And alas, I will have to run. I'll give it to Mr. Luber, but just very quickly, I think what you're saying about critique as part of the creative act, I think that is very important. And I do think there is something about science that culturally more thinks that way, that the science requires the peer review and the critique. Whereas perhaps often humanities critique is seen as this thing you need to get over, not that of which is necessarily part of the creative activity. Now, great, in my opinion, great artists know better, but and you could say that science sucks now because the peer review is not what people think. Peer review as a system is very different from what it actually is, and it has become perhaps mutated by the grant incentives and institutional incentives and so on and so forth. But in a more perhaps ideal form, it is one where seemingly the critique is seen as more important. I like what you're saying about poetry versus story. And the last thing is it's very interesting to me how when numbers are used in a unexpected way or a menti-divergent way, there's a way in which perhaps they function more like poetry to help the thing come out. But when numbers fit into the zeitgeist or the paradigm or the system, numbers actually keep the thing from coming out, right? Which might be a suggestion that it is not numbers as such that is the problem, but when they're in a preset structure, because the man is using numbers in a way you're not prepared for. The problem is numbers are used for plans, not to upset preset ideas. But if theoretically numbers were used to upset preset ideas, just like science, just like technology, just like anything, that it could perhaps contribute to the address, which then should give us hope because it would mean that nothing is necessarily part of the problem, right? That everything could actually be used perhaps in service of preparation or to make things come forth in a new way. But of course, that may also suggest that everything could be used to conceal them. Things that we think are good could actually, everything could be used in a disordered way as everything could be used in a way to bring out perhaps beauty. And it's all dependent on, well, us, I suppose, and our relation and our thinking. But let me give it to Mr. Luber. And before I have to run, Mr. Luber.
No worries. Seriously. Thanks for hosting this. It's amazing. I'm not okay. I'm painting AI pessimistically only insofar as a certain if we have a bad if we don't understand if we have a bad relationship to it, there's bad things is at least how I'm seeing it. If we have a good relation to it, than only like good things to come. So like, for example, this whole notion of like AI understanding its own excess. That is one step closer to having the dynamic between AI and the human more of a good relationship, because it will humble both aspects, or not aspects, sorry, both elements of the dichotomy AI human. So um, I think basically, sorry, I was looking at what you were saying. I think the only way, I think to have a relationship to access is, that's like when like we're getting into like the story dimension, because every time we have a certain domain, for example, let's stick with science, you hit the quantum enigma, and when that happens, Wolfgang Smith says vertical causation, which is a scientific way of saying storytelling. Literally, it's just it like he has the vertical causation. His book is basically the transition is transitioning science to storytelling by focusing on trying to solve that problem and what that would entail. And I think that's what's going to need to be done at every turn. But here's where I want to respond to Javier. How you respond can absolutely be critiqued. Like, in my opinion, you can critique the creative work, like not just like the actual product, but like how they made the product. Like, scientists, for example, do that all the time, where they're like, well, this study or this experiment was horribly done. Like, that happens all the time. Another way that, like in Hollywood, people critique how they make movies all the time, where it's like, wow, like, for example, they've been trying to make this Blade movie for years. How they're making it is going terrible. They can't get it off the, like, it's like, we got a director. Oh, the director doesn't want to do it anymore. Okay, we got to find someone else. It's like literally a nightmare situation where the studio wants it to be made, but they just, how they're making it is just not literally, it's literally not happening. So like, I do want to say, like, it's really important how we critique the creative act, because that will allow us to actually get in alignment with understanding a possible relationship to the excess. Yeah, very funny. So I think like what's creative, what's creative, what's interesting about everything is the creative act is literally trying to situate how even, oh, critique, that's creative, like understanding that dimension, because you'll hit like the bookend, you'll hit the limit where it'll allow you to like postulate how that limit has a relationship to its excess. Like, that's what thinking creatively will do. So I just wanted to say that, and yeah, this has been great. Thanks, Daniel.
No, fantastic. And that just makes me think that much of thinking about thinking is a certain critique of how thinking presents reality to you, or how thinking unfolds, which then turns out to be a creative act, because it creates what thinking is to you anew, and it perhaps can create new ways by which thinking engages with itself. But of course, I think a key characteristic of a creative act is that reflection upon itself is actually then part of the mechanism of its unfolding. It actually is part of itself, which is part of the secret of why thought finds its fullness not simply referencing something outside of itself that it defines itself in light of as, say, rational, irrational, whatever, practical or not. Thought finds it, like, unveils itself by thinking about thinking, and that then that changes the process by which thought occurs. And then we start actually getting at what thought is. And if human beings actually do that, then certainly AGI, as Mr. Winn has pointed to, can have these potentials. And then we would also have the ability to evaluate that what AGI produced was actually something more convivial than manipulative, more human than not. Forgive me for having to run on this afternoon, my fine friends. Thank you for being here. It is always a pleasure. All the best. All the best.